It's 11 p.m. in the Mojave Desert. The temperature just dropped to 28 degrees. And this man is sleeping inside a metal shell, no fireplace, no thick log walls, no insulation that any contractor would approve of, just curved corrugated steel, a concrete slab, and a decision most people called insane. His neighbor, a retired contractor with 30 years of experience, drove by during the build, rolled down his window, and said, "For words, you're going to freeze, buddy." That was 8 months ago. Tonight, inside the strange art structure sitting alone in the California desert, it is 71 degrees, warm, quiet, comfortable, the kind of warmth that seeps into your bones and makes you forget that outside, the desert is trying to kill everything that isn't adapted to survive it. And this man built it himself, with his own hands, on a budget that would make most contractors laugh before they even opened their toolbox. This is not a tiny house story. This is not a van life story. This is not some weekend warrior flip that got dressed up for Instagram. This is a story of a man who looked at the housing market, looked at his savings account, looked at 2.5 acres of raw Mojave desert land he bought for less than a used pickup truck, and made a decision that would change every single assumption he had about what a home is supposed to be. And by the end of this video, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about building, about warmth, about metal, and about what it actually costs to own a piece of land that belongs to nobody but you. Stay with me, because the part that nobody talks about, the part about why this metal cabin stays warmer than with cabins 3 times its price, that part is going to genuinely surprise you. Let's start at the beginning. He did not grow up building things. That is the first thing you need to understand, because this story only works if you understand who this man actually is before the desert, before the steel, before the welding sparks fly into the cold night air. He spent 22 years working in logistics, spreadsheets, shipment schedules, conference rooms with bad lighting and coffee that tasted like ambition that had already given up. He was good at his job. He was not passionate about his job. There is a difference, and that difference compounds over 2 decades into something that starts to feel very heavy. He rented a 1-bedroom apartment in a city that kept getting more expensive while delivering less of what he actually wanted from life. His rent increased 4 times in 6 years. His commute got longer. The walls of his apartment got no more interesting. At 51 years old, after a particularly brutal stretch where his company downsized and he found himself with a severance package and no immediate plan, he did something that his friends thought was either brilliant or a breakdown. And to this day, he says it was probably both. He bought land. Not a house, not a condo, not a starter home in a suburb 2 hours from anything. Land, raw, unimproved. Nobody wants it right now. Mojave desert land, 2.5 acres, Joshua trees, boulders the size of cars stacked by geology into formations that look like something a giant child built and abandoned, spectacular sunsets, absolutely brutal summers, and winters that drop to temperatures the desert's reputation does not prepare you for. He paid $18,000 for it. Let that number sit with you for a moment. $18,000. In a real estate market where a studio apartment in a mid-tier city requires a $40,000 down payment just to begin the conversation, this man bought 2.5 acres of land that he would eventually call home for less than the cost of a decent used car. But land is just land. And land without shelter in the Mojave is just a very scenic way to be uncomfortable. He needed to build something, and he needed to build it on what remained of his severance after the land purchase and 6 months of living expenses. That number was tight. That number was, to be direct, terrifying. He had approximately $28,000 left to build a livable structure. Every contractor he called laughed. Not cruelly. They were being honest with him. A traditional stick frame cabin on raw desert land, including permits, foundation, framing, roofing, insulation, electrical rough-in, plumbing rough-in, and basic interior finishing, was going to cost him a minimum of $120,000. And that was the optimistic estimate from the most affordable contractor in a 60-mile radius. He could not do it conventionally, so he started looking at unconventional. And that is how he found the Quonset hut. If you have never heard of a Quonset hut, here is what you need to know. It is one of the most battle-tested structures in human history. Originally designed for military use in World War II, these curved corrugated steel arches were built to be shipped anywhere on Earth, assembled by soldiers with minimal construction experience, and made to withstand environments that would destroy conventional structures. They were erected on Pacific Islands during monsoon season. They were built in the Alaskan tundra. They housed aircraft, equipment, field hospitals, and thousands of soldiers across every theater of the war. They survive because the arch is one of the strongest shapes in structural engineering. The curved form distributes load across the entire surface, rather than concentrating stress at corners and joints the way rectangular structures do. No internal load-bearing walls required. No ridge beam. No complex framing system. Just the arch anchored to a foundation, bolted together in sections. He found a supplier offering a double-arch Quonset kit, 2 connected barrel structures with a central breezeway in a 30 by 48-foot configuration. The entire steel shell kit, including all the corrugated panels and wall framing, door and window rough openings, and assembly hardware, cost him $14,200 delivered to his property. He nearly cried when he saw the quote, $14,200 for the bones of a home. He ordered it the same afternoon. The foundation came first, and this is where most self-builders make their first expensive mistake. He almost made it too. His initial plan was a full concrete slab across the entire footprint. Simple, solid, straightforward. But a conversation with a retired civil engineer he met at the local hardware store changed his approach entirely and saved him nearly $4,000. The engineer pointed out that in a desert environment with minimal frost heave risk, a perimeter grade beam foundation with a poured interior slab was not only structurally equivalent to a full monolithic pour, but with significantly less concrete, less labor, and less thermal mass in the wrong places. Thermal mass in the wrong places. That phrase stuck with him. He would come back to it later. It would become the foundation, pun very much intended, of his entire insulation strategy. He hired 2 laborers for the foundation work. 3 days. The perimeter beam was formed, poured, and cured. The interior slab followed. Total foundation cost, $6,800, including materials, the 2 laborers, and equipment rental for the concrete pump. The Quonset panels arrived on 2 flatbed trucks 11 days later. And this is where something shifted in him that he still talks about when he describes the build. When the steel came off those trucks, stacked in their labeled bundles, each panel a section of the arch that would become his home, he felt something he had not felt in the logistics office in 22 years of conference rooms and spreadsheets. He felt like he was building something real. Assembly of the Quonset shell is designed to be done by non-professionals. The system was literally engineered for soldiers who had no construction background. But that does not mean it is without challenges. And the challenges he encountered during his 2-week assembly process are exactly the kind of hard information that will save you significant time and money if you ever attempt something similar. The panels bolt together along their edges using pre-drill holes and heavy hex bolts. The arch rises in sections, each new panel locking into the previous one. The curve becoming more pronounced as you work your way up from the foundation anchors toward the peak. Working alone on the first day, the process was slower than expected. The panels are not impossibly heavy. A fit man can manage them, but holding a curved steel panel in position at height while simultaneously aligning the bolt holes is a 2-person job. It is technically a 1-person job if you have patience and the right improvised jigs. He learned this by day 3, with the help of a neighbor who had become curious enough to stop watching from a distance and start actually helping. The rhythm of the build accelerated dramatically. The neighbor, a welder by trade, looked at the connection system and immediately began suggesting improvements to the sealing approach of the panel joints, a detail that would prove critical later for both weatherproofing and insulation performance. The double arch, 2 connected Quonset sections joined by a central steel transition, took 11 days to complete. The end walls, which are framed conventionally with steel studs and infilled with the large glass doors and windows that now flood the interior with light, took 3 additional days. At the end of day 14, he stood on his concrete slab inside a fully enclosed steel structure in the middle of the Mojave Desert, looked up at the curved ceiling above him, and laughed for a long time. The show was done, and the show was also, at that exact moment, utterly unlivable. Because here's the truth about raw corrugated steel that nobody who hasn't lived in it will tell you. Without proper insulation, a metal structure in the desert is not a home. It is a convection oven in summer and a refrigerator in winter. The metal conducts heat with absolute indifference to your comfort. On the first night after the show was complete, with no insulation installed, the interior temperature tracked the exterior temperature almost exactly, dropping to 34 degrees before he gave up trying to sleep there and drove to a motel. The insulation phase was not optional. It was survival. And this is the part of the story that answers the question the title of this video asks. Conventional wisdom about metal buildings and insulation is mostly wrong. Not partially wrong. Mostly wrong. The standard approach that most people default to, fiberglass bad insulation stuff between framing members, performs adequately in rectangular stick frame construction because the framing creates defined cavities and the exterior sheathing creates a clear thermal boundary. In a Quonset structure, this approach is nearly impossible to execute properly and creates significant condensation risks at the curved steel surface where warm interior air meets cold metal. He researched this problem for 6 weeks before the shell was even assembled. He read building science papers. He watched hours of content from spray foam installers. He called 3 insulation contractors and asked pointed questions about curved steel substrates. The answer was closed-cell spray polyurethane foam, applied directly to the interior steel surface in a continuous, unbroken layer with no gaps, no seams, and no thermal bridges. Closed-cell spray foam does something that no other insulation material does as effectively. It bonds directly to the substrate, creating an air barrier, a vapor barrier, and a thermal barrier in a single application. When applied to the interior of a curved steel shell, it encapsulates the metal completely, eliminating the condensation risk, and creates a thermal envelope that transforms the behavior of the building entirely. His application was 3.5 inches of closed-cell foam across every square inch of the interior steel surface, walls, ceiling, the full continuous curve. At our 6.5 per inch, that give the entire shell an effective R value of approximately R, 22.75 across the curved surface, better than most wood frame walls. In a structure with no corners, no penetrations, and no interruptions in the thermal envelope other than the carefully detailed window and door frames, the spray foam contractor took 2 days. Total cost, $7,400. The night after the foam was applied, with no heating system yet installed, he slept in a sleeping bag inside the structure. The exterior temperature dropped to 31 degrees. The interior, with no heat source other than his own body heat and the thermal mass of the concrete slab radiating back the day's warmth, held at 52 degrees through the night. He did not go to the motel. He has not gone to the motel since. Interior finishing in a Quonset structure presents a design challenge that is also, if you approach it correctly, a design opportunity. The curved ceiling eliminates conventional drywall installation. Standard 4x8 sheets cannot bend to the arch radius without special scoring techniques. He chose a different path. The interior walls were furred out from the foam surface with treated lumber strapping, creating a service cavity for electrical wiring while providing attachment points for the finished surface. He used tongue-and-groove pine boards for the lower walls and ceiling, allowing material to follow the curve in narrow strips. The visual effect, warm with grain following the arc of the ceiling, is striking a way that no rectangular room can replicate. Flooring is polished concrete, the existing slab sealed and ground to a smooth finish with rented equipment. In a desert environment, polished concrete is not just economical, it is thermally brilliant. The slab absorbs solar heat admitted to the large south-facing glass doors during the day and releases it slowly through the night, contributing meaningfully to the passive heating performance of the structure. Electrical was run by a licensed electrician for the panel connection and final hookup, with rough-in work completed by himself under guidance. Plumbing was connected to a hauled water cistern system with a small on-demand propane water heater, the same basic water system used in thousands of off-grid desert properties across the Southwest. A small propane wall heater provides backup heat on the coldest nights, though he reports using it far less than expected. A 2,400-watt solar array with battery storage handles electrical needs that are, in a simply lived desert life, modest. Lighting, refrigeration, phone and laptop charging, a small window AC unit for the peak of summer, used sparingly. The total build cost, from land to livable structure, including all permits, solar, water system, and interior finishing, was $67,400 on 2.5 acres he owns outright, in a structure with no mortgage. His monthly fixed costs: propane, roughly $40 in winter. Solar covers the rest. 8 months in, on a Thursday evening in late January, he sat on the concrete patio between his two arch sections and watched the sun pull its colors across the Mojave sky in a way that only desert sunsets achieve. The kind of color that feels aggressive, almost rude in its beauty, like the landscape is insisting that you pay attention. The temperature was dropping. The Joshua trees were still against the cold air. Inside his metal home, the polished concrete floor held the heat of the afternoon sun, and the closed cell foam held the warmth of the interior against the cold of the desert night, and the arch above him was solid and quiet and entirely his. The retired contractor who had told him he would freeze drove by again in November. He stopped this time, got out of his truck, walked around the structure, looking at the panel joints, the end walls, the patio slab, asked if he could come inside. He stood in the center of the living space for a long moment, looked up at the pine-clad ceiling curving above him, felt the warmth of the room that was holding 68 degrees against a 35-degree exterior. He nodded slowly. "Huh," he said, and got back in his truck. High praise from a man who had spent 3 decades being right about buildings. Here is what this story is really about, and it is not about Quonset huts. It is about the moment a man decided that the conventional path, the approved path, the path everyone tells you is the only responsible path, was not the only path. It is about the terrifying, clarifying moment when you look at what your life has become and decide that the risk of changing it is smaller than the risk of not changing it. Building this cabin was not easy. It was physically demanding, financially stressful, technically complex, and deeply uncertain at every stage. There were nights during the build when he sat on the concrete slab inside an unfinished steel shell in the dark and genuinely did not know if he was making the bravest decision of his life or the stupidest one. Both things can be true. He has made peace with that. What he knows now, 8 months into a life that cost him less per month than his old apartment's utilities, surrounded by 2.5 acres of desert silence and boulder formations and Joshua trees that have been alive longer than anyone reading this has been born, is this: the conventional path is not inherently safer. It is just more familiar. And familiar is not the same as right. The metal shell he sleeps inside tonight is warmer than most of cabins, not because metal is a better insulator. It isn't on its own, but because he understood the science, refused a conventional approach, and built a thermal envelope that has no seams, no gaps, and no compromises. That approach works in insulation. It also works in life. You seal the gaps. You eliminate the thermal bridges. You create an unbroken boundary between the cold outside and the warmth you are trying to protect. He built that in steel and closed cell foam. He is still figuring out how to build it in everything else. But he has figured it out on his own land, under his own roof, in his own curved, improbable, contractor-doubted, desert-tested home. And tonight, when the Mojave drops to 29 degrees and the Joshua trees stand motionless in the cold dark, the man inside the metal shell will be warm. He built that warmth himself, and nobody can take it away from him.